We're in this information economy, and the currency is communications. In order to adapt to dynamic and sometimes volatile political contexts, we need to zoom out from the issues and platforms, because a minute later they are out of date, and people have moved on. From the bigger picture perspective, it's like storm tracking. There is a broader social phenomenon caught up in a storm, and that is driven by profit, in which contentious issues are always going to be the most enticing to leverage and manipulate for political gain.
Digital technology has transformed the speed, scale, sources, and reach of information. As Asia transitions to an information society and experiences higher internet penetration rates, understanding the impact of new information, communication, and technology on the region's political economy is growing in importance. While these technologies present many beneficial opportunities, the societal and political risks associated with information distortion and manipulation are of particular concern. Now, information manipulation, propaganda, or hate speech are neither unique nor new to the region. Rather, digital technology enables new tactics and incentives for actors with political, social, or commercial motives to create and share such content at unprecedented rates with real-world consequences. Our research looks at the political economy dimensions of information disorder in 3 Asian countries: Sri Lanka, the Philippines, and Indonesia. We chose these 3 countries for 2 reasons. The first, because all 3 have experienced the impacts of various levels of mis and disinformation. This is on individuals, marginalized groups, political systems and electoral processes, and community cohesion. The second is because the Asia Foundation has a long-standing collaboration with civil society partners who are leading the effort to understand and address this situation using a range of strategies. Also, by drawing on the work of our partners, we are better able to ground our analysis in historic and local context. For instance, modern means of communication today pose a high risk because they are rooted in past information disorders. Public communication in the region has also had a history of highly centralized control. This top-heavy control, a legacy of colonial times, was intended to segregate communities along class, race, and religious lines. Now, this resulting highly stratified media landscape has meant that it has been vulnerable to manipulation. On the other hand, independent media outlets in the region have been rare. There is also a greater receptivity among the public to alternative or more independent views. This relates to findings from recent research that suggests that people in Asia generally tend to trust information on social media more than in countries in the global north. Now, alongside this crisis of legitimacy of traditional media producers, control of mainstream media has become increasingly centralized and corporatized. But at the same time, all 3 countries have a vibrant civil society who are actively responding to these challenges and changes. And this is despite the broader context of shrinking civic space. Our aim through this research is to understand the dynamics of mis and disinformation production and its evolution, the role of various stakeholders and the power distribution among them, and map the various local efforts currently taking place to respond to this challenge.
Information disorder in all 3 countries has tended to peak during elections. With each new election, tactics have evolved. In the Philippines, for example, the first social media election was 2016. It was characterized by the proliferation of anonymous trolls, paid troll farms, and the use of bots to spread disinformation about political opponents. Public relations firms were hired to peddle disinformation through troll farms. A Facebook executive described the Philippines in 2016 as patient zero in the global disinformation epidemic. Macro and micro influencers were also at work in the 2016 election, the latter largely evading the radar of fact-checkers who were just getting started at this time. From the 2016 election to the present, a new phenomenon of cyber manipulation has evolved in the Philippines. It involves a broader range of strategic communication initiatives that don't necessarily peddle blatantly fake news, but are nonetheless still very effective in disseminating anti-democratic rhetoric and dangerous narratives by carefully mixing truth and falsehoods. Careful recreation of the history of the Marcos family, overlaid with appeals to nationalist populism, are an example of this. sociologist Nicole has described the 2022 election as a campaign of good vibes and toxic positivity.
A similar evolution is evident in the use of disinformation in election in Indonesia. Legitimate political actors with various vested interests in politics, government, and security have employed social media influencers, commonly referred as buzzer. Professional content creators paid thousands of dollars. They work to create and spread political propaganda to amplify specific narrative and shape public opinion. Since his election in 2014, for example, the current president, Joko Widodo, has carefully managed public discourse through the strategic use of this budget. They are essentially pro-government digital laborers who diligently work to promote Widodo's policy and persona, whilst simultaneously attacking his critics and detractors. This method of controlling the narrative became a hallmark of Widodo's administration, enabling him to maintain a favorable public image despite various controversies and opposition. The political scientist Ross Tapsell provides us a fascinating analysis of this phenomenon in Indonesian recent election in February 2024. He argues that in the 2024 election, the presidential campaign has transformed significantly, evolving into what he described as almost the opposite of traditional disinformation tactics. Instead of relying on negative campaign strategies, the campaign was meticulously crafted to consistently evoke positive energy and sentiments among the electorate. Tapsell notes it was a fake campaign without fake news. AI was used to sanitize discourse rather than muddy it, suggesting that advanced technologies were employed not to deceive, but to create an illusion of harmony, thereby engineering consent and subtle coercing public opinions. Meanwhile, observers of politics in Sri Lanka are already sounding the alarm about the potential for disinformation to significantly impact the upcoming presidential election, scheduled for October. These concerns are rooted in the increasing sophistication and reach of disinformation campaign observed globally. Information disorder during election is typically funded and orchestrated by powerful figures, especially those entrenched in the political spheres and their influential allies. Politicians and political parties often hire public relation firms to establish traditional trolls farms or employ buzzers and other gig workers on short-term contracts to disseminate various messages. These informal workers operate alongside and amplify the message of genuine influencers whose identities are known. These influencers might contribute to the disinformation effort either out of their own volition, driven by ideological alignment, or they are compensated for their participation. Moreover, the tactic have evolved to include the hiring of not just high-level influencers, but also micro-influencers in regional areas. These micro-influencers operate in local dialects, making the disinformation efforts more pervasive and culturally resonant. This approach ensures that the tailored message reaches a wider and more diverse audience, reinforcing the overarching narrative crafted by those in power.
Disinformation underpins the disorder in election information, targeting ethnic and religious minorities and women. This is especially concerning in Sri Lanka, where false narratives and incitements to harassment are common and fuel tensions. For the past 2 years in Sri Lanka has been mired in an economic crisis resulting from the government's sovereign debt default. In addition to disinformation related to ethnic and religious identities, an additional arena involves the economic crisis itself. That has included the spreading of false information on the negotiations with the IMF and various efforts of the government to respond, such as their current agenda to reform state-owned enterprises. While this is often misinformation spread out of ignorance, it highlights how many spheres of public lives are impacted by information disorder during a crisis. It is important to pause and understand Internet usage and information consumption in these parts of Asia, as it differs from other countries. In all three countries, most people use their mobile phones rather than computers or tablets to access the Internet. The common platforms include Facebook, YouTube, TikTok and X, as well as messaging apps such as WhatsApp and Viber. Official figures suggest internet penetration of 45% in Sri Lanka, 73% in the Philippines, and 67% in Indonesia. Low connection speeds, particularly outside large cities and in rural areas, have an important impact on how the internet is used. Low speeds mean people tend to use social media as their only method for going online. Many people in the region struggle to find and verify information online. They face issues like limited search skills, paywalls blocking traditional media, and a lot of content being in unfamiliar languages. This makes it hard for them to use the internet as effectively as people in the global north. Indeed, and as a result, many people in the region believe Facebook is the internet. In the Philippines, for instance, citizens in many regions in the country still rely primarily on radio and hard copy newspapers, particularly as there has been a decline in TV news access. Where there are just one or two radio stations, people tend to get curated information. In all three areas, there is also high reliance on information sharing via word of mouth, which tends to make them more vulnerable to disinformation that originate on social media. Given this context, several groups emerge as particularly vulnerable to disinformation. This includes older people and children who tend to have lower digital literacy and a greater sensitivity to conspiracy theories and deliberate false narratives. It also includes what in Indonesia has been called the scooter class, and in the Philippines it is considered the precarious non-poor, those whom during the country's transition to middle-income status can easily backslide into poverty if they experience an economic or health shock. Where they also live in communities where crime rates are high, they are more receptive to messages around safety and security framed in nationalist populist terms.
The impact of information disorder in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka is multifaceted. It stretches from the violence experienced by individuals and groups through negative impacts on the integrity of election processes to more broadly weakening social cohesion in countries with weak governance and many development challenges. At the individual and community level, recent research in Sri Lanka found that since the end of the conflict in 2009, hate speech disseminated on social media has contributed to violence against several minority communities. After the Easter bombings in 2019, for instance, online hate speech contributed to an increase in violence towards Muslim minorities. Similarly, research in Indonesia has found a disproportionate impact on minority communities, including psychological stress, economic damage, and sexual and physical violence. Those impacted include women, sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, and persons with disabilities. Attacks on human rights advocates are of particular concern in the Philippines. Under the polarizing and authoritarian politics of the previous presidency, human rights activists were specifically targeted as anti-patriotic, partisan, and conspiratorially allied with local or foreign bad actors. Research on the impact of targeted disinformation on human rights CSOs has shown that it put staff at risk, set back their work, and contributed to fragmentation and divisions within civil society. In Sri Lanka, civil society activist members of the Aragale protest movement, which is a People's Uprising 2022, that saw the removal of the president were also the target of disinformation. According to Forum Asia, democracy is regressing where digital civic spaces fragment through selective media consumption, social media blocks, filters, and content algorithms that create echo chambers that further polarize social groups. The impact on civil society speaks to the broad impact of mis and disinformation on the quality of democracy, not only in terms of the quality of election processes, but also of democratic institutions.
The debate on how to respond to information disorder centers on several questions. How to balance short-term, citizen-led mechanisms, such as fact-checking, with longer-term efforts, such as integration of digital literacy and critical thinking into education curricula. How and where government should be encouraged to regulate social media platforms in contexts that are experiencing overarching democratic decline and have seen governments use data security and other legislation to silence criticism. How to respond to the high level of influence on the platforms. Currently, the most prominent response mechanism in the region is fact-checking. Dozens of organizations are involved in independent third-party fact-checking of social media posts throughout the region. Many are registered with platforms such as Facebook, with whom they work to remove misleading and false posts. Our research suggests that fact-checking is useful. Posts that are fact-checked tend to be shared less by users. Fact-checking helps to raise awareness about the impact of mis- and disinformation. In situations in which civic space is shrinking, it is also generally apolitical. It doesn't directly challenge those in power who profit from broader information disorder. It is therefore a necessary but limited response in contexts in which there are few alternatives. For civil society in South and Southeast Asia, the potential to influence the large tech platforms responsible for information disorder is relatively limited. Some organizations do have influence, where they're designated as trusted partners and have channels through which to report information that violates agreed standards. However, timeframes involved make this form of fact-checking less and less feasible. Ultimately, its shelf life as a tactic is limited. Fact-checking relies on humans, while those who spread disinformation are increasingly leveraging AI to do so. As a result, with the rise of AI, fact-checking will always be on the back foot. Some informations are looking into using AI for fact-checking, yet they face several issues. Recent research by Learn Asia, for instance, found that few fact-checkers have the technical skills needed or tools that would work in an Asian context to support Asian language data screening. All the fact-checking organizations we worked with and spoke to are well aware of this and are all using and developing alternative response tactics. Governments that perpetrate disinformation are unlikely to be a constructive actor in regulating or controlling it. This is well understood. Many countries in the region have experienced government efforts to regulate the digital public sphere and provide greater security within it, that have reduced or restricted freedom of speech and association. Yet, that doesn't mean policy responses are dismissed altogether. Electoral laws and systems, for instance, are also being updated to accommodate the realities of social media use. Many also recognize how important education systems are in long-term responses to political and social impacts of information disorder. For instance, the Sri Lanka Press Institute is collaborating with the Ministry of Education in an effort to integrate critical thinking and digital literacy to school curricula. And there are other areas. Given the prominent role of advertising industries in the Philippines elections, some are calling for greater regulation of the advertising industry and financing through exposing the actions of particular companies. Where there are government champions willing to go against the grain, some of these efforts may bear fruit.
Beyond the policy realm, civil society organisations in all three countries are involved in a whole range of other initiatives, including working with local communities. Some are focused on particular vulnerable groups. For instance, in the Philippines, efforts are underway to improve critically needed digital literacy skills amongst migrant workers. Behavioural science research suggests that rather than calling out false information, it's often better to challenge it with an alternative narrative that's grounded in truth. Recognizing this, civil society organizations such as Dakila and Activista in the Philippines are developing techniques to change the ways in which people interact with social media. Dakila, for instance, uses art to spread messages of what it calls disruptive kindness. Along the same lines, Pratibha Media Network is working at community level in Sri Lanka to set up a school for journalists, with the aim of producing more accurate and better stories. In Indonesia, local CSOs are working to change intercommunal narratives by focusing on interreligious harmony. Moreover, all our partners working in this field recognise the importance of collective action and coalition building. In the Philippines, the well-known media platform Rappler has organised a coalition of over 120 organisations under the banner #FactsFirstPH. It promotes truth and fights disinformation. In Sri Lanka, a network led by #Generation is hosting a regional forum among local CSOs, think tanks and journalists from different ethnic and geographic backgrounds that works to counter mis and disinformation in South Asia. In conclusion, our research shows that civil society organisations in Indonesia, the Philippines and Sri Lanka have developed sophisticated responses to the disinformation storm. Civil society are direct responders to the impacts on individuals and communities, even as they work on longer-term initiatives that promote critical thinking in education and alternative narratives for social harmony over polarisation. Through their research and networking, they are proposing innovative policy solutions for greater integrity of information in the digital public sphere. They recognise that this is more than an internet issue, but one that jeopardises social cohesion and democratic governance more broadly. They are, however, solely under-resourced and operating in contexts in which the broader political economy is not conducive to these initiatives, where politicians and those in power are not only benefiting from information disorder, but are often colluding with private companies to produce it in the first place.